Okay. Renee, you're still there. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, I can see just fine.
Great. All right. So as was mentioned in the introduction tonight, I'm going to talk about the protection and recovery of Ontario butterfly species at risk with a focus on mottled duskywing, a species that I've been working on for the last probably 15 years or so. But first, just to kind of put things into perspective, I thought I'd touch on what are species at risk. So this is a term we hear often with regards to the environment and protection of the natural environment. We certainly have been hearing a lot about it with regards to things like Bill 23. And the term species at risk is often associated in the popular media by very charismatic, large kind of megafauna like polar bears, caribou, and orcas. But it actually encompasses a wide variety of species, and many of them are small arthropods or insects, and those are where my work tends to focus. So species at risk by definition in Canada are species that are at some level of risk of becoming extirpated or no longer occurring in Canada. And so we have several different status ranks in Canada, the first being extirpated, which means it no longer occurs here in Canada. Next is endangered, and that means it's at imminent risk of becoming extirpated if something isn't done to reverse the threats to that species. After endangered, we move to threatened, which is at imminent risk of becoming endangered. Generally in Ontario, species that are listed as endangered or threatened provincially automatically receive protection under our Provincial Species at Risk, or sorry, Endangered Species Act legislation. Both individuals and habitat receive protection. There's also one more level of at risk, which is called special concern. And this applies to species that aren't protected by legislation, but they are considered to be species to kind of be on the watch for. There's something happening with these species, they're declining in populations. And if something isn't done to manage those species, then they're likely going to be endangered or threatened in the future. So typically, when we talk about species at risk, I like to touch on the assessment process for these species and what that kind of looks like. So at the outset, we always do it at first a species status assessment. So we look at what the biology of the species is, where it occurs, what are its limiting factors within its natural history, and what are the threats that that species is facing. And those things are reviewed collectively to determine what the recommended status for a species should be. If a species is listed as endangered or threatened, as I mentioned, it automatically receives protection in Ontario under the Endangered Species Act. And that protection and that listing actually triggers a recovery planning process under the Endangered Species Act. And that is basically the mandate that the government has to develop a recovery plan, a document which will outline the steps which are going to be taken in order to reverse the trends to that population decline, in order to reverse declines of that species. After a recovery plan is implemented, after a recovery plan is finished, then of course we move on to implementation with the idea that all of those steps will be implemented to recover that species. There's monitoring and evaluation associated with that. And then the species comes up for reassessment. Typically, assessment happens on a 10-year time scale with the idea that by the time the species comes up for reassessment, something has been done in order to reduce the risk to that species. And in the best case scenario, its status will have changed to something less at risk. So what butterflies are at risk in Ontario? Well, in Ontario, we have a really wide diversity of butterfly species. It's among the most diverse places in Canada for butterfly fauna, mainly because of our geography in terms of how far south we reach. We're at the northern limit for many species. We also have several migratory species that come here and breed during the summer months, but don't necessarily overwinter here. And so we're really lucky with regards to butterflies, if you like going out and looking at butterflies. In Ontario, we have 6 butterfly species at risk currently, which I'll just touch on so everyone's familiar with them. Before I move on to the ones that are actually listed, though, I did recently add this slide about butterflies at risk to watch for. These are two species, the northern oak hairstreak, pictured on the right, and the Duke skipper, which is pictured on the left, that were recently assessed by the Committee of the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. So the federal committee that's responsible for assessing species at a federal level. The oak hairstreak was recommended as a status of threatened, where the Duke skipper has a recommended status of special concern. So those are statuses that have been recommended to the minister. It's now up to the minister to decide what the listing of those species will be. But I anticipate in the near future, these species will also be assessed at a provincial level and will likely be listed as species at risk. Currently, though, as I mentioned, we have 6 species at risk. And first and foremost, I'll talk about the Carner blue butterfly. This is the species that's often familiar to people in the context of species at risk. It's often used as kind of a poster species for invertebrate species at risk. It's a beautiful butterfly. But unfortunately, it is extirpated, meaning it no longer occurs in Ontario and therefore Canada, because it only ever occurred in Ontario. It specialized on wild lupin, which is the only plant that its caterpillars eat. And it was primarily associated with oaks and habitats. The second butterfly is the frosted elfin butterfly. Unfortunately, this species is also extirpated. It hasn't been seen since 1988. It was only known from one location in Norfolk County at the St. Williams Conservation Reserve, where it occurred with Carner blue. But it's likely that this species was much more widespread prior to European settlement. We just didn't know about it then. Thirdly, the eastern Perseus duskywing is also a wild lupin specialist. It is also extirpated. It occurred in some of the similar locations that Carner blue occurred, and it also hasn't been seen since the 1980s. So this is a range map that shows the historical distribution of these 3 species. The black triangles represent Carner blue. The red circles represent locations where eastern Perseus duskywing had been documented, and then that green square down at the bottom there near St. Williams is the frosted elfin. So you can see that the populations of these species were geographically isolated. They were restricted to southern Ontario. And it is thought, as I mentioned, that probably all of these species and their associated habitats were much more widespread prior to European settlement and clearing of the land for agriculture. So in 2017, I worked on the federal recovery strategy for the 3 lupin feeding butterflies I just talked about. The reason that we did a joint recovery strategy for these species is because they all feed on the same larval food plant, which is wild lupin. They all occupied similar habitats, and they all were facing the same threats. So it just made sense to take a more holistic approach for these species. So this recovery planning document outlines all the information we know about the Ontario populations, as well as the steps that are required if we are to think about recovering each one of these species. The 4th species at risk that we have in Ontario is probably familiar to all of you, the monarch butterfly. It is a provincial status of special concern. So in the context of species at risk, it does not receive any legal protection under the Endangered Species Act. Although some of you may have heard that CSIWIC, the federal committee, has put forward a recommended status to the federal minister that the species be listed as endangered. To date, that decision has not been made. So at a federal level, it is also still considered special concern. And monarch butterflies tend to be more habitat generalists, much more so than the lupin feeding butterflies I just talked about. Their larvae or caterpillars feed on a wide range of different milkweed species. And of course, they have the most famous migration of all insects. And these butterflies don't actually overwinter here in Ontario. They make annual migrations to Mexico. The 5th butterfly species at risk in Ontario is the West Virginia white. It also has a provincial status of special concern. Unlike the other butterflies, or most butterflies, I would say, that occur in more open habitats. This butterfly is a woodland butterfly. It feeds on toothworts, which are species that grow in kind of rich deciduous forests. So it's associated with those types of habitats. And then lastly, but not least, the mottled duskywing. And this is the species that the majority of my presentation from here on out will focus on. It's our only endangered butterfly that we have in Ontario. It's considered endangered at a federal level as well as a provincial level. It occurs in southeastern Manitoba, southern Ontario, and formerly occurred in Quebec, but it's considered extirpated from that province now. So it's the only butterfly that we have here that actually receives legal protection that's present under the Endangered Species Act. The mottled duskywing, like all butterflies, has a 4-stage life cycle: egg, larva or caterpillar, pupa or chrysalis, and then adult butterfly. Adult butterflies at most extant populations only occurs through one flight period in the springtime. So they usually come out around mid to late May. They fly throughout the month of June, sometimes into the very first part of July. And that's the only time you see them flying during the entire year. They spend their entire life in the same small geographic area, overwintering here in Ontario. Their larvae feed on New Jersey tea, which is the plant pictured on the right-hand side there, and a very closely related species that looks very similar called narrow-leaf New Jersey tea or prairie redroot. So those are the only plants that this species can feed on. And similar to the lupin-feeding butterflies, they have been and are associated with oak savanna habitats, but they have a slightly larger range in terms of their habitat requirements. They also occur in alvar habitats, and even sometimes more disturbed habitats that formerly were associated with oak habitats or alvar habitats. So just a visualization of the life cycle of this butterfly. So as I mentioned, they have a very small kind of geographic area. They spend their entire life history in a very small area. Excuse me, I think I'm going to sneeze. Oh, pardon me. And so female butterflies will lay eggs directly on ceanothus plants. Eggs hatch within a few days, and then the larvae, which are pictured on the right-hand side there, are green with little black heads, and they feed on these plants throughout this entire stage. They create little leaf nests using silk, which you can see in the illustration here, in order to kind of provide some protection and cover. And often they'll hide in those leaf nests during the day and then come out at night to feed on the plants. And then the larva moves through a series of instars, meaning they shed their skin and grow larger and shed their skin and grow larger. And that usually happens 5 to 6 times throughout the summer. And then once they reach maturity, they enter a period of what we call diapause, which is basically inactivity, and they go into a state of torpor. And that's where they'll remain and overwinter. So eventually the leaves fall off the plants onto the ground, and they overwinter in their little leaf nest on the ground. And then in the springtime, they pupate and emerge in early spring as a butterfly. So they live out their entire life, you know, in just around their host plants, and sometimes just single little patches. So this is a range map showing the historical and current distribution of the mottled duskywing. The yellow circles represent extant populations that we know about, although it is a pretty well surveyed for species, so I don't expect there are many populations we don't know about. The blue and green triangles represent populations that are no longer occurring in those locations. And so the green ones mean they haven't been seen since as recently as 2007, and the blue ones are they haven't been seen since before 1996. So you can see just by looking at this map that there has been a significant contraction in the range of this species, and it's been lost for many sites. You might also notice that several of the sites where it occurs, like along the shore of Lake Huron around Grand Bend, in the Long Point area near St. Williams, around High Park in Toronto, those are all areas that we saw consistent with where Corner Blue occurred as well, and likely those other lupin feeding butterflies as well. So the recovery strategy for Mottled Duskywing, the provincial one, was completed in 2015. And as I mentioned, a recovery strategy is just a planning document that outlines the steps that need to be taken in order to reverse the threats to a species and reduce its at-risk status. So why are some of our butterfly species at risk? So what has happened that's put all these butterflies in such dire circumstances? Well, as I mentioned, many of these species that I talked about are associated with oak savanna habitats. And for those of you who aren't familiar with oak savanna communities, these are tall grass communities that have 25 to 35% tree canopy closure. So a fairly specific range of tree canopy closure. When you get less tree canopy than that in a tall grass community, you have a prairie. And when you have more, upwards of 35 to 60% tree canopy closure, you're more looking at an oak woodland, and then more than 60% canopy closure, an oak forest. In Southern Ontario, the trees associated with oak savannas are primarily black oak, and they have understory savanna indicators, which include things like big blue stem, little blue stem grasses, wild bergamot, wild sunflower, smoothleaf aster, and wild lupin. These communities are adapted to fire, which helps maintain an open or semi-open canopy. And so fire suppression is considered a very high threat to these communities. So traditionally within Southern Ontario, these communities would have been maintained by First Nations communities who actively burn the land for cultural reasons, to prepare land for medicinal plants or crops, or for hunting. And so once the Europeans settled on this land, fire was sort of removed from the landscape, and large-scale clearing of habitat occurred in order to farm the land. So visually, this is typical of what an oak savanna community looks like, often even with less tree cover than this. So you can see there's these scattered kind of mature black oak trees with a tall grass prairie community underneath them. So in Ontario, it's estimated, in North America, it's estimated that up to 11 million hectares of habitat like this existed on the landscape prior to European settlement. And upwards of 2,000 kilometers squared of these types of habitat actually existed in Ontario before settlement. So as I mentioned, the land was cleared and converted into agriculture, and of course now continuing housing developments. And so this has left oak savanna habitats as very isolated and disjunct patches throughout Southern Ontario. And then these disjunct habitat patches are then exposed to further threats. Notwithstanding the initial habitat loss and habitat fragmentation, they're also threatened by improper habitat management. So the removal of fire or other disturbances, which helped maintain that semi-open canopy. In the absence of fire, the canopy closes in, it shades out all the understory plants. Many of them, the tall grass indicator species that I mentioned, they're totally intolerant to full shade. White-tailed deer, if left unchecked, can be a large threat to these butterfly habitats because they like to munch on the larval food plants. Invasive species can change the composition of a community, and so that threatens these butterflies. Climate change is a real threat. We don't really understand the mechanisms or the extent to which it could threaten butterfly species at risk, but for example, one thing that is concerning is phenology, so the timing of when butterflies emerge and their associated larval food plants. For a species like Mottled Duskywing that comes out really early in the spring, the females, when they emerge from their chrysalis, the plants are just starting to emerge, and they of course need those plants to lay their eggs on. So in the future, if climate change results in a mismatch of emergence between larval food plants and butterflies, that could have serious implications for the persistence of populations if butterflies don't have the adequate food resources to lay their eggs on. And then lastly, pesticide use. Of course, insecticides and pesticides are generally bad for insect communities, but in particular, spraying BTK to control spongy moths is a specific threat to these butterfly communities. And the reason for that is because spongy moths They like to eat a wide variety of tree species, but they really like oaks in particular. And so often in the oak savanna communities, the oak woodland communities where we find these rare habitats, you see spongy moth defoliation. And right now, the chosen method to deal with that by many municipalities and conservation authorities is by aerial spraying. And BTK is a larval specific insecticide, but it is not specific to spongy moth alone. So anywhere that that insecticide is sprayed has the potential to impact any butterfly or moth species that are in larval form. And because many of these species are early emergers, they often have larval periods that overlap with the spongy moths. So that's a concern. So that's all the bad news about what's going on with butterfly species at risk. And so I'd like to change direction here and talk about what's being done to protect and recover butterfly species at risk. And that's where the Ontario Butterfly Species at Risk Recovery Team comes in. So this is a team that was formed in 2017. There's a wide diversity of members that are part of the group from a wide range of organizations. So it includes members from academia. We have representatives from 3 different universities, nonprofit organizations such as Nature Conservancy, the Long Point Basin Land Trust, representatives from First Nation communities like Alderville First Nation. We have federal and provincial government representatives. Who am I missing? We've got representatives from High Park Nature, Wildlife Preservation Canada, the Cambridge Butterfly Conservatory. So it's a very wide in terms of specialization group. And all of these organizations and individuals were interested or somehow involved in butterfly protection or conservation at the outset of this team being formed. And they all had something different to offer. Some are working on restoration projects, some were working on research, some were working on captive rearing interests. So the team decided to get together and start collaborating in order to pool our resources and really work on conservation problems related to butterfly species at risk. So this gives you an idea of just all the organizations that are involved in the team. We do have a website that's mentioned there, and I think I showed on the last slide as well, that talks about some of the projects that I'll be talking about today. It also has biographies about all the members, and I do try to keep it updated with our news and events as well. So when we first formed the Ontario Butterfly Species at Risk Recovery Team, of course, we needed to have a mandate. And so we decided that our mandate would be to promote the conservation and recovery of Ontario's butterfly species at risk and their habitats. That was very general, it was very broad, it gave us a lot of wiggle room to do kind of a range of different projects. But in the interim, short term, we also decided that we needed some very specific and measurable objectives for the team, things that we needed to work on. And so the short-term goals mainly focus on mottled duskywing, but some of them don't. You can see them here. So basically, we're working on supporting and protecting existing populations of mottled duskywing. This is our only endangered species. If something isn't done imminently to protect and recover it, it's going to disappear and meet the fate of some of our other butterflies. So that's the species we decided to focus on. We wanted to support activities which resulted in the reestablishment of mottled duskywing at some of the formerly occupied locations and really start to widen that range out again. We also wanted to support research that filled in knowledge gaps, not only for mottled duskywing, but all butterfly species at risk. And support the creation and enhancement of butterfly species at risk habitat, and especially oak savanna habitat, which not only is beneficial to butterflies, but is beneficial to a wide range of species at risk that occur here in Ontario. Provide support to land managers, and then of course, conduct and support outreach and education about the work that we're doing. So in order to do this, we needed money and we needed a lot of resources. And so to date, before leading up to the formation of the team, all these different organizations and individuals were working kind of piecemeal on individual projects. Many of them were funded either 1 year or 2 years through various grants, but to really tackle issues related to recovery, you need to think a bit more long-term, and you need a lot of money to do it. And so several members of the recovery team decided to apply for an NSERC Alliance grant. This is a National Research Council grant. It's a federal grant that's administered to academics. So we needed a principal investigator at a university, and that is Dr. Ryan Norris at the University of Guelph. But it's also a partnership grant. So it not only includes academia, it includes industry as well. And so the main partnership was formed between the Nature Conservancy and the University of Guelph. But then there were also several other partners from the recovery team that contributed to the grant as well. So it really is a collaborative grant. And through the grant, we were able to raise enough matching contributions that NSERC gave us a 2-to-1 match. So for every dollar we were able to raise in cash contributions for our grant, NSERC gave us $2 more. So we were able to triple our money, which was really, really good. It also gave us guaranteed funding for 5 years to do things that we wanted to do. So I'll talk about some of the projects that we've been able to achieve through this NSERC Alliance, but most notably, I think, is just student and person power. So we've been able to fund one PhD project, which is ongoing. 2 master's students have already graduated who completed projects, and we have 2 who are actually working on projects right now. We still have funding for 1 more. And then this slide actually says we have funding for up to 12 summer students a year, but in 2022, through other subsidies, we were able to actually hire 18 summer contract staff to work on this project with us. So we're basically employing a small army of students and young conservation professionals to work on this project, these various projects. And that itself, I think, is a great accomplishment because it's giving all these young people real world experience and applied conservation skills through working with a variety of people. And they also get exposure to all of these organizations and experts that are involved on the team. And it's really an impressive level of expertise that we have on our team. So just circling back to this range map that I showed you, the Mottled Duskywing, the historical and the current distribution, the intent with the grant that we identified was to start looking at reintroducing Mottled Duskywing to formerly occupied locations. That was like the main goal of the grant. And the first place we wanted to look at doing that was Pinery Provincial Park. And I had done some of the legwork before this grant, leading up to it, looking at some of the locations that we might think about reintroducing populations. So we knew that Pinery was well positioned in order to receive a population. Next, we were also looking at Norfolk County in and around the St. Williams Conservation Reserve and lands owned by NCC. So those were the 2 focal projects we were looking at as part of the grant, but then there was also consideration for augmenting existing populations that we knew were really facing a lot of threats and had really low population sizes so that they didn't wink out. So some of the current projects that we're working on, one is habitat restoration, are obviously a really important part of species at risk recovery. The Nature Conservancy and Ontario Parks and the Long Basin Land Trust, Alderville Black Oak Savanna, all of these partners have done amazing work to restore tallgrass prairie and oak savanna habitats on the landscape. This has been done by land acquisition, invasive species management, seeding, and reintroducing burning onto the landscape. So there's many different active projects that are ongoing. Many of them started before the recovery team formed, and it's just kind of proceeded into something that the recovery team is involved in. But many of these organizations are doing a fabulous job in creating and restoring habitat. Next is a long-term mark resiting study. So as I mentioned, Dr. Ryan Norris is the principal investigator of our NSERC grant. He is primarily a population ecologist, so he's interested in population and demography of species. And so that's what his students are studying in regards to the Mottled Duskywing. This work has been extremely instrumental in everything else that has followed. Before we started doing mark reciting work on Mottled Duskywing, we knew little to nothing about their longevity, how long adult butterflies lived, how they move around or between habitats, what their exact phenology was, like when they came out in the spring, when they finished flying, when their populations peaked, or how many butterflies occurred within populations. And so the mark reciting work involves very simplified terms, marking one day and reciting the next day, marking one day, reciting the next day. And that happens throughout the entire flight period of the butterfly. And Ryan's students have been doing that at 3 different sites for the last 4 years. 2 of them are the largest populations that we know about in Ontario, and 1 is a smaller, kind of more isolated population. They mark the butterflies very strategically, as you can see on the bottom right there, using nail polish. And each butterfly is given an individual mark so that when it's marked and then recited, we know exactly where that butterfly was marked. If we recite it again, we know exactly where it was the previous time we saw it. So it gives us an idea of its movements. We've also been working on conservation genetics. So when you talk about recovering species populations, especially ones that are considered to have low population sizes, genetics is an important consideration. We wanted to know what the genetic diversity of the existing populations we have are in order to inform reintroductions. Not only do we need to know that in terms of a source population, like where we're going to get butterflies from, but also in terms of like, do we even have enough genetic diversity within a population to go and create a population somewhere else? So this work is being led by Dr. Nusha Kegelbody at Western University. This is the young lady pictured in these photos is Shayla. She recently completed her master's, and she was able to develop the genetic markers for Mottled Duskywing as a touchstone for us, and determine the levels of diversity within all of Ontario's extant populations, as well as populations in Manitoba and the United States. So this has given us a huge amount of information that we didn't previously have about this species. We also have a new master's student who just started, Aya, and she's going to continue working on this in terms of continuing to monitor source populations and reintroduce populations for genetic diversity. The third really exciting project that's come out of this NSERC is our captive rearing program. And so this program is led by the Cambridge Butterfly Conservatory. Adrian Brewster, who's the executive director there, leads this program. And of course, any reintroduction program usually has some sort of rearing or breeding program associated with this. And we started thinking about captive rearing back in 2018 when we used a surrogate species called the wild indigo duskywing as kind of our guinea pig, so to say. So we didn't want to bring endangered butterflies into captivity to play around with them. We wanted to have some of the things we needed to know figured out before we did that. So we used this wild indigo duskywing to do that. And so using the wild indigo duskywing, we were able to determine how we would feed butterflies, how much host plant we might need to feed larvae, what kind of cages we should keep them in, what the temperature should be, what the humidity, what the light should be, like all of these things we had to work out before we brought Mottled Duskywing into captivity. So that's what we spent 2018 doing. And then in 2019 and 2020, we actually brought female Mottled Duskywing into captivity. We were astounded by the success we had. Butterflies readily laid eggs in the lab, which is not always the case with butterfly rearing programs. So we had lots of eggs, as you can see pictured in the middle photo there. We had a very high success rate in hatching eggs. We had a really high success rate with larval survival. And ultimately, those 2 years of our trials, we released our butterflies that we reared out back to the source population because we weren't quite ready to do any moving around yet. And then in 2021, we decided we were well enough prepared and had enough information in terms of our source population status, the genetic diversity, and our captive rearing protocols to move forward with an actual reintroduction. So the first reintroduction occurred in 2021. when we released 692 mottled duskywing at Pinery Provincial Park along the shore of Lake Huron. So this was really exciting, not only for mottled duskywing, but it represented the first ever reintroduction of a butterfly in Ontario. And because we had had such success at the Butterfly Conservatory rearing individuals, we were actually had the opportunity to play around a little bit about which life stage would be most suitable for reintroductions. So in the context of butterfly reintroductions, there's no hard and fast rule as to what works. So if you look at the literature and talk to people who are involved in reintroductions in the United States or Britain, different places in the world, some butterflies perform really well when they're released as eggs, some as larvae, some as pupa, some as adults. It really depends on the species. And we didn't know what was going to work for mottled duskywing. So what we decided to do was to do 3 different treatments: 1 release of larvae, 1 release of pupa, and 1 release of adults in 3 different geographic regions of Pinery Provincial Park. And that would kind of give us the opportunity to monitor how those populations fared and help us make a decision moving forward about what we wanted to do in terms of a release strategy. In 2021, we implemented a mark resighting program similar to what we were doing at the egg stem populations, where we were there every single day marking and resighting butterflies to track what they were doing. We also were tracking the pupa releases and trying to track the larvae, which proved very difficult in the wild. And we also confirmed oviposition or egg length, which was really exciting because it meant that female butterflies were mating in the wild and they were laying eggs naturally in the environment. So that was really promising in terms of our observations 2021. And then, of course, everything went dormant for the season and we packed up for the season and left. And then we had to wait with bated breath over the winter to see what would happen. And it was really nerve-wracking because this is probably the where we know the least. Very little is known in general about, the overwintering strategies of insects. We know little to nothing about what mottled duskywing requires to overwinter. So we weren't sure what would happen. Oh, sorry, I missed this slide. This is just showing some of the different photos of the work that we were doing over the summer. So in the top left-hand corner there, you can see the pupa. So we released pupa in little PCV tubes, which you can see in the bottom left there. Mainly, this was to protect them from predators. So we had large mesh on the top, so birds and larger things couldn't get in. We had fine mesh on the bottom to allow drainage. And this allowed us to kind of check on them every day and determine their status. And this worked really well because we were able to see if they successfully eclosed or hatched. We were able to see if they were predated. And so we could actually track what happened to each individual. On the right-hand side with the flags there, that was us marking larvae that we released. If you recall the photo I showed earlier, they're very small, they're very green, and they're very hard to track. So larval tracking didn't go so well for us in 2021, but that's okay. So flip forward to 2022, the good news was very early on, we discovered that we had successfully, butterflies that successfully overwintered. And the way that we found out was actually kind of interesting. Ryan, Norris, and I were at Pinery getting ready and set up for the oncoming field season. It was really early in May, the weekend of May 14th, I think. And so our field crew hadn't even arrived yet. And I received an email from a colleague of mine who reviews and vets butterfly observations on iNaturalist. And he said, Jessica, someone has just spotted a mottled duskywing at Pinery Provincial Park. They didn't identify it as a mottled duskywing. They identified it incorrectly, but he said, look at the photo, it's a mottled duskywing. And sure enough, it was. So that's how I found out the first butterfly overwintered, but it was nonetheless very exciting. We immediately went out and started looking, and we also found mottled duskywing. Some interesting observations that we had in 2022 included first and second broods of butterflies. So you might recall that I noted that all the extant populations that we know about has one flight period. from mid-May until early July. But previously, the records do suggest in southwestern Ontario that there used to be 2 broods of butterflies, so 2 separate flight periods during the monitoring or during the summer season. And interestingly, the butterflies at Pinery reverted to having 2 flight periods, which was really exciting to see. We also confirmed oviposition, so butterflies laying eggs. We confirmed butterflies mating, as you can see in the photo here. So that was really exciting. We also, in terms of the treatments, it appeared after 1 year that pupa and adults, our site seemed to do really well. That's where we saw the most butterflies emerge in the spring. Whereas we released larvae, we saw very few butterflies. And so we weren't sure after just 1 year if it was the site, because it was a separate site that the butterflies weren't responding well to, or it was the treatment, the fact that we released larvae. So in 2022, we did additional releases, which were always planned, but we decided to switch up the treatments a bit. So where we had larva releases last year and didn't see a lot this year, we released adult butterflies. We decided to try larva releases at a second site where no butterflies had been released yet to test that treatment again. And so next year, we should have a pretty solid understanding of what treatment and what sites are best at supporting this species. And then moving forward, we will choose the one superior treatment for releases moving forward. All of the work at Pinery was done by Wildlife Preservation Canada. So they support the monitoring team there, and we've had really good success. We've been really lucky with the crews that we have. We've had many staff return between the 21 and 22 monitoring season. They're really dedicated and super keen. So of course, what goes along with all of this research that we're doing is also stewardship and outreach. So we've tried to do a lot of that to get the word out, not only about Mottled Duskywing, but just in general, the habitat recovery work that we're trying to do. We were really lucky to get some funding with Pine Grove Productions to create a 3-year documentary about the work that we're doing. So they started filming with us the year that we started, one of the years we started planning. And so they documented the whole process of planning, implementation, and then this year as well, when we saw the first butterflies overwintering. So that should be coming out early next year. I'll be letting all the field naturalist groups that I've been talking to know about it when it does come out, because we're really excited about it, and it features a lot of the different work that I've talked about today. Of course, we've been doing lots of outreach talks. We have a website, and there's lots of swag and apparel. And I haven't made a slide about it yet, but new to the outreach activities that we did this year was that we partnered with a local brewery in Guelph, Ontario, who made a Mottled Duskywing beer. So that was pretty exciting. It made for some great social events, and all the proceeds from the sales of the beer go to the butterfly recovery efforts. So in terms of next steps, in 2023, we plan to continue our monitoring program, both at the exit sites and at Pinery Provincial Park. We have additional releases planned at Pinery. Most recovery programs, look at releases for 3 to 4 years with the idea of building genetic diversity and abundance for a self-sustaining population. As I mentioned, we have a full-length documentary coming out. We're looking at doing the additional reintroductions in Norfolk County based on what we find out in the spring at Pinery. And then on top of all of that, something that's recently come online is I was approached by the Canadian Wildlife Service to do a frosted elephant recovery feasibility assessment. And so this is really exciting because this species has been extirpated since 1988. It seemed like recovery of the species was a long way off, but based on the headway we've been able to make with Mottled Duskywing, it's really paved the way for recovery of some of these other butterfly species at risk that we've lost. So with that, I'd just like to acknowledge all of the funding that these projects have received. Many of the partners on the recovery team have made contributions. We've also been the recipient of funding from MyTAC, as I mentioned, NSERC, the Provincial Species at Risk Stewardship Fund, Lambton Wildlife Inc., and the Toronto Entomologists Association through their Butterfly Research Fund. So with that, I'll say thank you. My contact information is there, and I'd be happy to take questions if you want to put them in the chat or pop your camera on and ask them.